"Can I clean your barn for a plate of food?" But when the Truggling rancher saw her, he froze. She didn't knock. She didn't scream. She simply knelt bare knees in the snow, one hand clutching her child, the other steady as she asked, "Can I clean your barn for a plate of food?" In that instant, something in the rancher cracked. Bo Ramsey, former soldier, now one-handed, hollowed by war and winter, hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. He'd buried his wife, lost his arm, closed the world outside his door. But the woman, she wore the scarf of a man Bo once bled beside. And the child? She had Luis's eyes. What follows isn't just a tale of survival. It's a story about the weight of promises kept long after the grave, a fire, a trial, a letter from the dead, and two people trying to build a home from ash and silence. Before we begin, leave a comment below. What would you have done if she showed up at your door? And if you're someone who believes in second chances, in stories that start at the edge of frost, hit subscribe, because the next knock at the door might just be yours. The scarf that froze time. The wind was cruel that morning, less like weather, more like a memory scratching its way back. Bo Ramsey stepped out of his barn into that bitter December air, left hand bracing the door as it creaked against rusted hinges. Same old motion, same old silence, but this time, something waited at the edge of his land. She didn't knock. She knelt, just past the gate, in that red Texas dirt turned half to frost. A woman crouched like someone halfway between praying and breaking. Her coat was more thread than warmth. Her arms cradled a child too still, too quiet. And when she lifted her face, her voice came not as a cry, but a simple request. "I can clean your barn," she said. "Just a plate of food." For her. Bo didn't answer. He didn't have to, not yet. What stopped him wasn't the desperation in her eyes or the tremble in her jaw. It was the scarf, tied around her neck like a promise, barely holding on, faded yellow, red-stitched agave blossoms in the corner. He'd seen it before, long ago, in a place too far from this frozen ground. And in that instant, something in his chest gave way. "Where'd you get that scarf?" he asked. She hesitated, not out of fear, but memory. "It was my husband's," she said. Bo took one step closer. "What was his name?" "Luis," she said. "Luis Ortega." That was it. The wind didn't howl anymore. It listened. Bo stood still, the air thick with something that wasn't quite sorrow, not yet. His right sleeve hung loose, empty, like the part of him that had never come back from war. Luis Ortega had been more than a friend. He'd been a lifeline, a brother. The only man who laughed like bullets were jokes and patched wounds with fabric and faith. Luis had dragged him out of the mud when his shoulder was shredded to the bone, had used that exact scarf to stop the bleeding, had whispered, "Not here, hermano, not beside me." Luis, who was later branded a deserter. Luis, who never made it home. Bo's jaw tightened. His eyes didn't meet hers, but his voice came low, dry, steady. "Come inside." She didn't move right away. "I'm not asking for pity," she said. "Only work." "I know," Bo replied, still not looking. "That's why I'm letting you in." He turned, walked toward the house, and left the door open behind him. She followed, carefully, holding the child closer with each step. The girl didn't cry, just looked around like she'd seen it all before. The house was no warmer than the wind outside. Bo poured hot water into a dented tin basin, lit the stove again, and placed the basin near it without saying a word. The woman stood by the doorway, unsure. Her shoes had cracked at the heel. Her hands shook, but not from the cold. Bo set a tin plate down, broke a cornbread biscuit in half, placed it near the child. Still, he didn't speak. He didn't owe her, but that scarf, God, that scarf. Some debts don't live on paper. They live in the shape of a stitch, in the silence of a man who never got to speak in court, in the eyes of a child whose face echoes someone long buried. Bo didn't need to explain that, didn't want to. All he did was keep the door open. Because sometimes, keeping a promise isn't loud. It's just not walking away. A widow's hope, a rancher's silence, The house didn't welcome them. It didn't have to. It stood like the man who owned it, quiet, weather-worn, and unwilling to say more than it had to. Mira stepped inside with Lucia pressed against her chest. The floor creaked beneath her feet. The walls smelled like smoke, pine, and something older, something you couldn't name without living there a while. She didn't ask if she should sit. She just stayed by the door until Bo gestured barely with his chin. There was no conversation, no offer of comfort. Bo placed a chipped mug of hot water on the table and moved back to the stove. She whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer. He wasn't being cruel. He was being careful. Bo did everything with one hand. She noticed that first. The way he stirred the fire, opened the door, even set a plate down. The other sleeve hung empty, stitched shut, as if trying not to remind anyone of what had once been there. In the corner, Lucia lay curled up on a wool blanket, half asleep. Mira knelt beside her, brushing soot from the girl's brow. She didn't speak again. Outside, the wind scratched the windows. Inside, time folded in slow, patient layers. By the next morning, the sky had turned bone white. Ice clung to the roof like claws. The stove had gone cold during the night, and the house felt more like a memory than a home. Still, Mira didn't leave. She woke early and swept the floor, though no one had asked. She found a needle, threaded it with thin gray string, and began mending the tear in an old blanket. Later, she stepped outside and cleaned the stalls. The hay was brittle. The air cut through her dress, but she worked, one task after another. Bo watched her from a distance, said nothing. When she returned to the house, there was a loaf of bread on the counter, not fresh, but whole. No note, no glance in her direction, just bread. She broke off a piece for Lucia and warmed it by the stove. They lived like that for days. Not as a family, not even as friends. More like survivors sharing a shoreline after the same ship went under. Bo would pass her a tool. Mira would wordlessly take it. She'd refill the kettle. He'd move it to the fire without thanks. He still hadn't asked her name. She still hadn't offered it. But she saw things. She saw the way he leaned into walls, not from fatigue, but out of habit, as if bracing against something no one else could see. She saw how he opened the barn gate with his elbow, how he scrawled figures into a ledger with painstaking care using his left hand. He did not complain. Not about the cold. Not about the silence. Not about her. And Mira. She stopped waiting for the moment he'd finally speak first. Maybe some men didn't need conversation. Maybe the act of not turning you away was the only kindness they had left to give. One afternoon, while Lucia napped near the fire, Mira patched a sleeve on Bo's coat. She didn't ask, just did it. When he saw it later, his face didn't change, but he wore it the next morning. That was something. She'd known men who used words like fences, tall, white, and meaningless. But Bo's silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt more like a field, wide, quiet, maybe even lonely but not locked. She still didn't know why he let her stay. Maybe it was the scarf. Maybe it was the child. Maybe it was something else, something older, heavier, and harder to name. But in the hush between them, she began to breathe differently, slower, less like someone bracing for the next blow, more like someone remembering she had lungs for something other than surviving. The fire crackled. The barn stood. The snow melted slowly in the trough. And no one asked anyone to explain why they were still there. Maybe because leaving would require saying out loud what neither of them knew how to admit. So they stayed. And somehow, in all that staying, something soft began to return. Not love, not yet, but something like space. And sometimes, that was enough. I see what's missing. The snow returned like it had unfinished business. Bo crouched beside the firewood pile near the side of the barn, trying to strike flint against kindling. The wind kept stealing the sparks. His coat hung heavy with wet, his jaw clenched, silent as the axe he'd left buried in the wood earlier that morning. He struck again. Nothing. The spark fizzled before it caught. Mira watched from a few feet away. She hadn't meant to linger, but something in the way he kept failing deliberately, stubbornly made it hard to turn away. He dropped the flint, picked it up again. His left hand moved with precision, but he struggled. His body twisted just enough to show her. He had only one hand, and it wasn't enough right now. She stepped forward. "May I help?" she asked. Bo flinched not from fear, but from habit. His shoulders rose like shield. "I can do it," he said. Not cruel, just tired. "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet, careful. "But you don't have to." He didn't move. "You only have one hand," she added. Not as judgment, not as pity, just fact. His gaze snapped to hers, not angry, just exposed. "Most people see what's still there," he said. "They don't notice what's missing." Mira stepped closer, not out of bravery but because something in her wouldn't let her stay distant anymore. "But I do," she said. Bo didn't reply, not for a long moment. Then, with a breath slow and hollow, he handed her the flint. She struck once. Flame. The kindling caught, and the fire whispered to life. They didn't smile. They didn't say thank you. But something passed between them, something quieter than words and louder than silence. Later that afternoon, Bo showed her how he managed the ledger. He didn't explain the numbers, only how to steady the ink bottle while he wrote with his left. She watched his fingers move slow, cramped, but certain. "You used to be right-handed," she said. "Yeah." She didn't follow up with, "I'm sorry." She just nodded, and that nod meant everything. He started letting her do more. Not because she asked, but because he didn't stop her anymore. Fix the latch on the stable? She did. Patch a saddlebag? Done. Lift a child's sleeping body from the rug to the bed? He watched her do it, and didn't correct her grip. That night, as the wind howled through the rafters and Lucia slept with her hand curled around Mira's thumb, Bo sat across the room sharpening a blade, slow and deliberate. The room smelled of leather, smoke, and stew left warm on the stove. Mira looked up. "You don't let people help, do you?" Bo didn't look up. "What makes you say that? You flinched when I offered." He paused, knife hovering over stone. "I'm not used to being seen," he said. "Not really. You are now." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't comfort. It was something deeper. Recognition. That night, he left his coat near her chair not because she asked, but because he saw the way she pulled at her shawl when the wind moaned through the crack. And in the morning, he found the porch had been swept clean. He didn't ask. She didn't say. But from then on, their silence stopped being distance. It started to become agreement, an understanding built without blueprints. No one had to say it aloud, but something in both of them had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, just shifted, enough to make space for the possibility that they weren't alone in their missing pieces. Enough to know that maybe being seen wasn't the same as being weak, and maybe being needed didn't mean being pitied. Sometimes, it just meant someone noticed your hands were full and still stood beside you. A letter buried in dust. It came from the shelf behind the stove, an old tin box, rusted at the corners, shut tight with a loop of leather. Bo hadn't touched it in years, maybe longer. The night was still. Lucia had fallen asleep under a quilt Mira had stitched that morning. Her soft breaths rose and fell in rhythm with the fire. Mira sat at the table, mending a button on Bo's spare shirt. He crossed the room, slow, placed the box in front of her. Didn't speak, didn't sit, just stood there like a man handing off a weight he could no longer carry. She looked at the box, then at him. He gave a small nod, turned, and walked out onto the porch. The wind had calmed, but not fully. It murmured through the broken eaves like an old voice trying to return. Mira opened the box. Inside, a folded paper, creased with time, browned at the edges. The ink faded, but the hand was familiar. She'd seen it on the backs of old grocery notes, love letters left under pillows during war. Louise. Her fingers trembled. She unfolded the page, laid it flat against the grain of the table, and began to read. Bo, if she ever comes to you, don't ask her why. Don't ask her how she made it. Just keep her. Keep her like blood. She's braver than I am. She's got her own reasons for silence. Don't break it. Just hold it. You'll understand. Tell her I died with her name in my mouth. By the time she reached the end, her hands were no longer shaking. They were still. Not numb. Just still. She stared at the paper as if it were breathing, as if any second Luis would speak again. She traced the last sentence with the edge of her nail, again and again. Then, without wiping her eyes, she folded the letter back into its creases. The exact creases, like a soldier making a bed before leaving it one final time. She placed the letter back in the box, closed the lid, didn't cry, didn't move, until she heard the slow scrape of chair legs across floorboards. Bo had returned, sat down across from her, hands empty, voice steady. I didn't read it until after. Meira nodded. He knew. Another silence, not heavy, not cold, just shared. She picked up the shirt again. The thread had slipped from the needle. Bo reached across the table, picked it up with surprising ease using his left hand, and handed it back. That was the first time they touched brief, fingertip to fingertip. A flicker. That night, after she'd gone to bed and the fire had dimmed to a glow, Bo stayed up. He brought out Luis's old coat, the one left behind like a second skin. The lining was torn, the buttons gone. It still smelled faintly of sweat, cedar, and gunpowder. Bo sat by the window with a spool of black thread and began to stitch it back together. One-handed, clumsy, uneven, but patient. Each pull of the thread was a sentence he never got to say. Each knot, a page of history no court ever heard. He didn't need it to be perfect. He just needed it to hold. Because keeping your word to the dead wasn't about guilt. It was about continuing something unfinished. And some things, some people deserve to be kept warm, even when they weren't coming back. The coat sewn with memory. The sun didn't rise so much as it hesitated. It crept across the floorboards in thin lines, slow and unsure, as if asking permission to touch the quiet that had settled in. Lucia was still asleep when Mira noticed it. At the foot of the child's bed, carefully folded, with more reverence than skill, lay a coat. Not just any coat. It was older than the dust on the windowsill, rough in texture, lined with mismatched wool. The buttons were thick, uneven, the collar patched where it had once torn, but it was clean, freshly stitched, and unmistakably Luis's ember too. Mira didn't reach for it. Not at first. She simply stood there, breath held somewhere between chest and throat, watching the early light trace every crooked thread. She knew this coat the way one knows a voice in a dream, blurry around the edges, but unmistakable at the center. Her fingers moved gently across the seams. The thread wasn't straight, some loops doubled back, like the hand that stitched them had trembled or never learned to stitch at all. But it held. Every line, every clumsy knot, whispered the same truth. Someone tried. Someone cared enough to try, even without knowing how. Bo had done this. No one else could have, and he hadn't said a word. That silence, more than any spoken kindness, undid her. She didn't cry, didn't even sigh. She just laid her palm flat across the coat, closed her eye, and bowed her head not in grief, but in gratitude. There are gestures that don't ask to be witnessed. This was one of them. When Bo stepped inside minutes later, brushing snow from his shoulders, he paused. He saw her standing there, hand on the coat, eyes closed. He didn't interrupt, didn't clear his throat or shift his stance. He just set his gloves on the table and looked away, as if embarrassed to have been caught offering something too raw. Because it wasn't just a coat, it was a memory. Luis's. And now, theirs. That night, Lucia wore it like armor. It hung off her shoulders, sleeves dragging, but she wouldn't take it off. She slept curled in it, fist clenched around the top button. Bo sat across the room, sharpening his old knife, watching. Not the girl, not the coat, but the way Mira looked at both. There was no conversation, only understanding. The kind that comes when love has no vocabulary left. In the flicker of the hearth, with no ceremony, no thank yous, no grand moment, something settled between them. Not a promise. Not yet. But a shape, a form. The slow beginning of a bond made not of passion but of preservation. Love, in this house, came not in declarations but in stitches. Uneven, off-center, but strong enough to hold. The fire, the cellar, the vow. It started with smoke, not the kind from breakfast coals or a chimney that hadn't been swept. This was sharper, oily, intentional. Bo smelled it first, just a trace, carried on wind that wasn't supposed to shift that way. He stepped onto the porch, squinted toward the barn. A thin column of black rose behind the ridge. Then came the sound, a pop, then another, wood splintering under heat. Bo didn't run. He turned back inside, face unreadable. "Take the girl," he said. "Now." Mira froze. "What is it?" "They lit the east fence," he said. "They'll be here in minutes." She didn't ask who. She knew. There'd been eyes in town. The kind that followed her too long. The kind that remembered Luis not as a man who'd saved others, but as a man who'd refused to bow. And now they remembered her. "They're after me," she whispered. Bo didn't correct her. But he didn't agree either. He pulled open the trap door beneath the kitchen rug. The air from below smelled of dirt, whiskey, and old regret. He grabbed a lantern, lit it with practiced care, and handed it to Mira. "Go." She hesitated. "You too," she said. He shook his head. "I'll stall them." "You can't." "I can." Mira looked at him, really looked. Not as the man who'd given her shelter, but as the man who now stood between her and the kind of men who burned truths they couldn't silence. "They're not just after me," she said. "No," Bo said. "They're after silence, and we're the wrong kind of quiet." He turned back to the door, but her voice stopped him. "If you stay, they might kill you." He didn't even blink. "If I go, they'll keep coming." Lucia tugged her mother's sleeve. Mira lifted her, held her close. Together, they climbed down into the cellar. It was small, lined with wine racks and canned peaches from some past season. But it was dry, thick-walled, safe. Bo dropped the trapdoor shut behind them, locked it from above. She pressed her ear to the wood. For a long time, nothing. Then boots. Then shouting. Then quiet. Not victory. Not yet. Just pause. When the hatch creaked open again, hours had passed. Maybe longer. Bo's silhouette filled the frame. His face was soot-streaked, his shirt torn at the elbow, but his eyes were calm. He helped them out gently. No rush. No stories. Outside, the barn was gone. The fence, too. But the house, scarred, smoke-kissed, still stood. Inside, Mira collapsed into the nearest chair. Lucia, still clinging to her side, looked at Bo. She didn't speak. But she reached out, small fingers extended. Bo knelt, not out of weakness, not even out of exhaustion. He knelt because there are vows you don't make on one knee in a ring. Some vows are made in ashes, with what little you have left. "I may only have one hand," he said, "but I'll build you a wall with it." Lucia touched his cheek. She didn't understand the word, but she understood what it meant to be chosen. And Mira, watching from across the room, eyes wet but steady, understood too. Because sometimes what saves you isn't fire or flight. It's a man with no obligation, no armor, no promise, who chooses to stay. Her voice in the barn court. They held the hearing in the barn because the courthouse had burned down 2 winters ago, and because the mayor didn't want it in town. It was just past noon. The air was still, thick with dust, and watching. Bo stood behind Mira, silent, solid. She stepped forward. No one called her name. There was no gavel, no polished benches, just hay, worn boots, and the rusted whine of wind slipping through the slats in the wall. At the center, a table. On it, a single letter, folded, yellowed, creased. Luis's handwriting stared up from the page like something still breathing. The man sitting across from her, Eldon Cray, wore a gray vest stretched tight over a belly that hadn't missed a meal. His mouth curled like he'd already decided the ending. But Mira didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, then down. Her hands trembled. The letter fluttered like it could take flight if she let go. Behind her, Bo stepped closer. Without asking, he reached forward and placed her hand over his chest. "You're shaking," he whispered. "Let me hold that." His voice wasn't loud, but it held, like fence posts in wind. She didn't speak right away. Then she inhaled, shallow, sharp, and let it go like she was shedding something. "My husband," she began, "was not a traitor." Cray chuckled, low. "Wasn't a soldier either." He ran. "No," Mira said, her voice steadying. "He walked away from a massacre. One you ordered." Gasps rippled. Not loud, but enough. Someone in the back shifted, uncomfortable. She opened the letter, read it aloud. Every word, every pause. Her voice cracked once, but not from fear. From memory. "If she comes to you, Bo, don't ask her why. Just keep her. She's braver than I am. Tell her I died with her name in my mouth." When she finished, she folded the letter again, carefully, as if Luis had just spoken in the room and she was tucking him back into silence. Then she looked at Cray. "I'm not asking you to believe me," she said. "I'm not even here to prove anything." He smirked. "Then why stand there?" "Because the dead can't," she said. And just like that, the barn went quiet. So quiet you could hear a nail loosen itself from the beam behind her. Bo didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood with his hand still resting on the place where hers had been. The judge, a traveling magistrate with eyes too tired for politics, cleared his throat. "We'll recess for deliberation." But no one stood. Because justice, in that moment, wasn't about the ruling. It was about the air. Something had shifted. Someone had said what everyone else was too used to swallowing. And it didn't take shouting. It didn't take tears. It just took one woman, standing in her own name, without flinching. The truth didn't need defense. It just needed someone willing to carry it through the fire, even if no one clapped when she made it out. And Mira, she didn't ask for applause. She only asked to speak. A reckoning in rope and silence. They brought Eldon Cray out before the frost had even begun to lift. The gallows stood behind the barn, rough-hewn, blackened at the joints, as if it too remembered what had been done here. No official crowd gathered, just a small cluster of people who'd run out of things to fear or things to hide. The man walked on his own, hands bound, boots dragging just enough to remind them he didn't want this. Not really, but he wasn't begging either. He held his head high, in the way snakes sometimes still raise themselves before the end. Mira stood just beyond the post. Her coat was buttoned, her eyes dry. No veil, no trembling. She hadn't come to see him hang. She'd come to witness something that should have happened long ago finally finish happening. Cray caught her gaze, didn't smile, didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said, "You should have died with him." The words weren't spit. They were ash. Mira didn't flint. She didn't answer. There are silences more cutting than any retort. She carried that kind. Bo stepped forward then. Quiet, steady, not as a hero, just as a man who'd had enough of letting evil speak without interruption. He faced Cray not like an accuser, but like a mirror, something Cray couldn't look into for long. Bo said, "When the rope tightens, you'll feel it." Cray's brow lifted. "Feel what?" "Every voice you buried, every name you erased. They never left. They've just been waiting for your weight." The marshal gave no speech, no blessing, just a nod. The lever dropped, and Cray fell. No cry, no curse. Just the sound of rope holding its first truth in years. Behind her back, Mira's fingers curled, not clenched, not afraid, just remembering. When it was over, they didn't linger. There was nothing left to watch. But as Bo helped her onto the horse cart, Mira paused. Near one of the barn's support posts, half buried in earth, she spotted a nail rusted, bent, forgotten. She bent to pick it up, slipped it into her coat pocket. Bo noticed, said nothing, but he understood. Some things are not kept as trophies. They're kept as reminders. Back at the house, Lucia ran to them barefoot, coat slipping off one shoulder. Bo lifted her with one arm still clumsy, still sure, and carried her inside. Mira followed. The house was warm now, not from fire, but from what had stopped burning. She placed the bent nail on the windowsill. It didn't look like much, but it had once held something that was never meant to last. And now, it rested in a home built to stay. Justice hadn't roared. It had arrived like snow, quiet, cold, and final. And this time, it had left space for someone to live on the other side. built from ash and memory. Spring came later than usual that year, but when it did, it came quietly like a child entering a room where grief had just fallen asleep. Lucia sat on the porch steps, chalk in one hand, a crooked L scrawled on the wood beside her. She grinned like she'd invented language. Mira stood in the kitchen, apron dusted in flour. Her voice rose through the window steady now, not catching on old sorrow. She was telling a story, one with horses and clouds and a woman who never ran. Bo leaned against the doorframe, one hand in his coat pocket, the other resting on the post. He watched them. Not with pride, not with disbelief, just stillness. The kind that comes when the storm has left and nothing inside you is bracing anymore. Lucia looked back, waved her chalk-streaked fingers. Bo nodded. "I used to think I'd lost everything," he said, "almost to no one." Then, softer, "Turns out, I just started finding it." He didn't step forward. He didn't have to. Some men are born father. Others become them, by choosing to stay. Some debts are never paid in coin or blood, but in the choice to stay, to care, to rebuild with what's left. This story wasn't about justice served loudly. It was about quiet truth, carried across frost and fire, until someone chose not to walk away. Which moment struck you deepest? Was it Mira's voice in the barn? Bo's one-handed vow? Share your thoughts below. Someone else might need the lesson you found. And if you've ever seen yourself in that child waiting in silence, hoping someone might open the door, know this. Here, there's always a story for you. Subscribe so when life grows quiet and cold, you'll know where to return. Not for answers, but for recognition. Let this story linger like smoke on old wood. And ask yourself, even after the screen fades, if someone knocked, would you be quiet enough to hear what they're not saying?